Okay, so we're going to be looking here at Chapter 3, looking at ecosystems. What are they and how do they work? So the big thing about understanding ecosystems is that an ecosystem really is all about relationships. So we're dealing with relationships inside of a habitat, okay? Inside of even if it's a small habitat, you're dealing with a geographic, an ecological area, all right? And you're looking at the populations and communities of organisms that are inside that area and how they relate to one another, okay? So the relationships within the habitat amongst individuals, populations, communities. And when I say communities, I'm not just talking about human communities. I'm not just talking about human interactions. I'm talking about how all of the organisms within a certain habitat are relating to one another. You watched a video from the BBC about different types of relationships between insects or with an insect and a certain plant. Okay? Those relationships help determine what the ecosystem is and how does it work and how is it functioning. All right, so at the beginning of the chapter, it talks about the tropical rainforests, talk about how they are disappearing. Okay? Tropical rainforests are probably one of the most important ecosystems that are on the planet, simply because, you can see on the bottom of this slide, they are unbelievably diverse in terms of their biodiversity. Okay? They're 50% of the world's known plant and animal species exist in tropical rainforests. Okay? And that's not even counting the number of species that have yet to be discovered. Okay? Tropical rainforests, in terms of human health and human economy, think about just how big of a pharmaceutical plant a tropical rainforest is. There are species of plants inside the tropical rainforest that haven't been discovered that could hold the cure to numerous diseases that affect mankind. Okay? They only cover about 2% of the Earth's land surface, but again, biodiversity is really, really important. We're going to talk about diversity in terms of three different aspects. You're going to talk about genetic diversity, you're going to talk about species diversity, and then you're going to talk about functional diversity. Okay, genetic diversity is just that. Okay, what are the different types of genes that are present amongst a population and amongst a community inside of an ecosystem? Species, how many different types of species and how many numbers of those within those populations do we have? And then functional is where we start talking about a niche. Okay, what role does a certain species play in an ecosystem? And functional diversity means that you've got a number of different types of species playing a number of different roles and occupying a number of different niches within an ecosystem. Obviously, since we talked about the carbon cycle, disappearing tropical rainforests are going to accelerate global warming because you are getting rid of a huge carbon sink. So therefore, more carbon dioxide is going to get up into the atmosphere, thereby increasing temperatures. And then, of course, changing regional weather patterns. Okay, and we can actually see on this next slide, here in 1975, okay, you actually see in Santa Cruz, Bolivia, pretty much untouched tropical rainforest. All right, and then you deal with 28 years later, and you see the picture on the right, and there you're dealing with lots and lots of grazing area. And notice the brown. Okay, it goes from really lush green to brown. Okay, the soils are not very good. This area now is going to be more susceptible to possible drought because you don't have as much evapotranspiration taking place from the trees and plants that once occupied the rainforest. Okay, that stuff gets evaporated, goes right up into the atmosphere, condenses as water, rains back down. Okay, so you're actually going to see a differing of that regional climate because of the loss of all that life. All right, so the first section of 3.1, what keeps us and other organisms alive? Here we're going to be talking about the four major components of Earth's system, or the four spheres. Okay, the four spheres are the atmosphere, the hydrosphere, the geosphere, and the biosphere. Okay? Atmosphere is the gaseous envelope that surrounds the Earth. Hydrosphere is all the water. The geosphere are the physical features, rock, soil, sediment. And then the biosphere is all living things on Earth. Okay? And then the three things that sustain life on the planet: the flow of energy from the sun through all the living things, the cycling of nutrients within the biosphere is also within the geosphere too, and then gravity holding everything down. So again, here we're talking about the atmosphere, hydrosphere, geosphere, biosphere. These are the four spheres. The two major components of the atmosphere that you need to know are the troposphere, which is right at the surface. So you have the surface of the Earth, and then here is your troposphere. And then above that is the stratosphere. We can actually go up further than that. You get the mesosphere, and then the thermosphere, and then the ionosphere above that. But really, in terms of environmental science, it's the stratosphere and the troposphere that are most important. The troposphere is where all the weather happens, and really you're dealing with about 75% of the total atmosphere right there at the troposphere. Okay, and as I mentioned before, hydrosphere is all the water. All right, so here we get into, the hydrologic cycle. The atmosphere is involved with the carbon cycle, the water cycle, okay, the sulfur cycle, and the nitrogen cycle. Okay, so all four of those cycles have components in the atmosphere. In the geosphere, all right, phosphorus cycle is there. The sulfur cycle, okay, carbon goes through the geosphere, the water cycle goes through the geosphere, nitrogen cycle goes through the geosphere, okay, and then the biosphere, all the life certainly impacts all five of those nutrient cycles. Here's a graphic for all of the four different spheres, so you can see the atmosphere, the geosphere, hydrosphere, biosphere there. And again, going back to diversity, the three main types of diversity you're going to need to know, and we're going to wind up doing a lab on this in a week or two: species diversity, genetic diversity, and functional diversity. And again, we'll get further into that. But again, what you're looking at here are animals or plants that fulfill a role, or they actually have a niche inside of an individual ecosystem. Okay? You see an ecosystem on the lower right. You've got an ocean ecosystem. Okay? You've got a small portion of an ecosystem down on the bottom left with the butterfly and the flower. Okay? You've got a really large ecosystem picture up in the upper left. Okay? Where you actually see all four spheres combining. Okay? You've got the hydrosphere with the water and the ice caps and the clouds. All right, you've got the geosphere with the mountains. You have the biosphere with all the plants. Okay, and then the atmosphere, obviously you see where those clouds are moving through. So that right there is a picture of all four spheres. All right, so factors that sustain life on Earth. So the big thing is this one-way flow of high-quality energy. Okay, and one of the things that I'm going to ask you and kind of challenge you to think about is a question of: should humans eat lower on the food chain? Okay, and it all has to do with the way energy flows through a food chain. Okay, through each level of the food chain, there is less and less energy available than what was there at the level before. Okay, and we'll talk about this further as we get through this video. We've already talked about biogeochemical cycles. It's a cycle of nutrients through the parts of the biosphere and the atmosphere and the geosphere and the hydrosphere. Okay? And then gravity holding the Earth's atmosphere in place. Okay? The Earth's atmosphere is perfect with regard to what we need for life to be able to sustain. Okay? I've heard a number of astrophysicists, ecologists, ethnobotanists, biologists talk about how Earth is in what is known as the Goldilocks scenario, or the Goldilocks position. Okay, and that means that everything is just right. We're not too close to the sun, we're not too far away from the sun. The atmosphere is 78% nitrogen, 21% oxygen, the rest trace gases, Temperature is just right so that water can exist on the planet in all three states of matter simultaneously. Okay? We're in the Goldilocks scenario. All right? Everything is just right for life to have been able to form and evolve. So here we're dealing with sun, earth, life, and climate. Okay? Obviously, the sun produces all kinds of energy. You've got ultraviolet radiation, visible radiation, infrared radiation. Okay? And that radiation that comes in takes a number of different paths. Okay? It can be absorbed by the ozone, other atmospheric gases. It can be absorbed by the earth and all the things that are on it. It can be reflected by the earth. It can be reflected by cloud tops high up in the atmosphere. And then it can be radiated by the atmosphere as heat. All right? One of the things about the Goldilocks scenario that keeps temperatures the way that they are is this natural greenhouse effect. The greenhouse effect is good. Okay? Too much of the greenhouse effect is bad, and that's where we deal with Venus. But the natural greenhouse effect is a necessity for life to be able to continue to thrive on Earth. And here's what I'm talking about with regard to the greenhouse effect. We've got solar radiation coming down, okay, in the form of ultraviolet radiation, visible light, you've got some infrared, okay? So here we've got radiation that is reflected by the atmosphere, all right, and it bounces back into space. Visible light penetrates the atmosphere down to the Earth's surface, it gets absorbed, okay? Ozone, all right, absorbs ultraviolet radiation, okay, and that's why ozone is so important. And we're going to get further into talking about the ozone layer and the problems that we had with the ozone layer a number of years ago and how it's kind of bounced back, okay? So this is the solar radiation coming into the atmospheric system, okay? Here you've got the troposphere, where all the weather takes place, okay, and where all of our heat is located. So this heat is added to the troposphere by re-radiation of heat from the Earth's surface, okay? The greenhouse effect is we've got this blanket of greenhouse gases that allows that heat to not fully escape, okay? Some does wind up escaping back out to space, all right? But a lot of it is trapped underneath. That's the natural greenhouse effect. This is good. If we were to thicken the blanket here of greenhouse gases, now you're increasing the amount of heat that gets trapped underneath, thereby raising global temperatures. Okay? So if you exacerbate the greenhouse effect and make it more intense, then that's where you're gonna have temperatures rising. All right, components of an ecosystem. All right, some organisms produce the nutrients they need. Those are producers, photosynthesis, chemosynthesis, where we're talking about. Others get their nutrients by consuming other organisms. All right, consumers would be herbivores, carnivores, omnivores. Some recycle nutrients back to producers because they decompose. Okay, so there's a number of different roles that organisms play inside of an ecosystem. Okay, so looking at interactions in nature, that's what ecologists do. All right, they look at individual organisms, they look at populations of organisms. They then look at a collection of populations, which would be communities. They look at a number of different communities combining together in one geographic area, which is an ecosystem. Then they look at the collection of those ecosystems into the biosphere. Okay, so really you're getting from an individual all the way up to a large collection of everything. Okay? And ecology is the interactions between living organisms and their non-living environment. So again, here is the basic structure of what we just talked about. Okay? And it even goes a little bit further down to the minuscule portions of each individual organism. So you start with the atom, and you're moving yourself up to a molecule. Molecules form cells. Collections of cells form organisms. Okay? An individual living being. A population is a group of individuals of the same species living in a particular place. Then you've got a community, okay? Populations of many different organisms living in a particular place, okay? Then here, an ecosystem is a community of different species interacting with one another and their environment, okay? And then the biosphere is basically all of those ecosystems together. So one leads into the next and leads into the next, into the next. Ecosystems will have both living and non-living components. Living components, okay, are biotic. Okay, that means they are living or they once lived. Abiotic is non-living and never lived. Okay, so water, air, nutrients, rocks, heat, solar energy, all that stuff is non-living and it never lived. Okay, rocks can have some components of things that once lived. Okay, you can say that a certain type of sedimentary rock, a certain type of limestone is an organic limestone because it contains shell material that was created by something that was once living, but a rock is still an abiotic factor. So here we're looking at, a typical ecosystem. Okay, you've got solar energy, all right, and you've got carbon dioxide in the mix. Plants take in carbon dioxide, okay, and they release oxygen, all right. That plant would be a producer. You have a primary consumer, primary meaning kind of first level consumer, and that is the rabbit. So the rabbit eats grass or eats these leaves from the tree. The secondary or second level consumer here, all right, would be the fox. Okay, the fox eats the rabbit. All right. If we had a third level, okay, maybe you've got a larger predator that would prey on the fox. Okay, let's say, I don't know, in this ecosystem, I'm not sure if bears actually prey on foxes, but you could have a third level consumer that would actually prey on the second. Okay. Now what you have down here in the bottom are these decomposers. So when producers, all the way up through first level, second level, and third level, when they die, like what we see over here, this dead rabbit, okay, the decomposers go to work, all right, and they break those organisms down. Okay, they break those organisms down and they create these mineral nutrients that then go back into the soil to help feed the producer again. All right, so things about ecosystems, again, it's very cyclical. Just like we talked about with all of the different biogeochemical cycles, it's very cyclical. So again, producers, they are autotrophs. All right, get familiar with this suffix trophs. Okay, because basically a trophic level is a feeding level. All right, so an autotroph is an organism that creates its own food. All right, now I am not an autotroph because I made myself some eggs this morning. Okay, the only way I could be an autotroph is if I were to be able to undergo the processes of photosynthesis or chemosynthesis. Photosynthesis, where I'm taking carbon dioxide and water and sunlight, and I create glucose and release oxygen. Okay, the chemosynthesis process is using interior chemicals to be able to create food or nutrients like glucose within the organism. All right. Primary consumers are herbivores. They're the ones that eat the producers. And then you've got secondary, tertiary consumers, and you can go all the way up to the top of a food chain or a food web. Carnivores are strictly meat eaters. Omnivores means that they eat both producers as well as other consumers. So again, producers. Producers are your plants. Okay? Producers in a lake or an ocean ecosystem would be certain types of phytoplankton. And then you've got your consumers. Okay, here we see a giraffe eating a plant. All right, and then the lion is actually looking maybe at that giraffe, thinking hello lunch, but she's also got something down there at her feet that she's eating. All right, so then we talked about decomposers, but I also wanted to mention this detritivore. Okay, detritus, okay, is dead bodies, all right, of other organisms. Okay, decomposers basically are bacteria and fungi that basically are broken down. They basically break down these dead organisms, okay, and then they release nutrients. detritivores basically feed on dead bodies. So these guys here, another word for this would be like a scavenger. All right, so you've got vultures, okay? We see a lot of turkey vultures in this area, all right? Whenever you're kind of out and you see like those birds that are just kind of circling, there's probably a dead animal somewhere very close by. So here's some decomposers, all right? You've got a fungus up in the upper left, and then you've got a detritivore, you've got those scavengers down in the lower right. So here's a diagram from your book, okay? So you've got time progression. So you have this trunk of a tree, okay? So you've got these longhorn beetles, bark beetles, carpenter ants, termites and carpenter ant, okay? You've got dry rot fungus, okay? As time goes on, all right, so this is, at this point, I guess we'll call it, quote unquote, freshly dead in terms of this tree trunk. And then as time goes on, all right, you get these longhorn beetle holes right here. And then the bark beetle winds up doing this quote unquote engraving because it's feeding on this section. Carpenter ants start to work, okay? They continue their work. Termites then come into play. The wood then becomes, you know, kind of dry rotted and a fungus forms here. And then as time winds up continuing to go on, that wood is like reduced to almost like a powder. And then another type of fungus winds up being created here, and that powder is then broken down by that fungus, and then those nutrients wind up going back into the soil, okay? So you've got your detritus feeders early on, and those are your beetles and your carpenter ants and your termites, and then the decomposers are your fungi, and then any bacteria that wind up helping to break down that wood powder. So when we're talking about components overall of an ecosystem, okay, got to have solar energy. All right, solar energy helps the producers produce. And then the consumers eat those producers. And then upper level consumers eat those other consumers. Producers and consumers die, and then they get decomposed by bacteria and fungi. Their bodies get eaten on while they're freshly dead by detritivores, okay? And then the chemical nutrients are then released, okay, because of those decomposers. It can be released into the soil. It can be released as carbon dioxide to get back up into the atmosphere, okay? But if you'll notice, every single step you are losing heat to the system, okay? This is something that's really, really important to remember. You lose heat to the system. So talking about this stuff, we want to talk about available energy to organisms at every single feeding level, all right? It decreases. So the maximum amount of energy you're going to have in a food chain or a food web is at the producer level. You have consumers that eat those producers, okay? They only are able to take with them so much energy from those producers. The rest is lost as heat to the system. Let me show you what I mean. So in a food chain, the movement of energy and nutrients from one trophic level to the next, okay? It actually goes photosynthesis into feeding into decomposition. Okay, a food chain is a very simple representation. And usually it's so simple that really, you know, doesn't really exist in its simplicity. Okay? Really what we want to talk about is we want to talk about these food webs. But when we talk about the transfer of energy from one level to the other, we're going to do it in terms of a food chain just because it's a little easier to understand. So here's a food chain. We've got solar energy, okay, helping these plants create what they are because of photosynthesis. So here's your first trophic level and its producers, okay? So the second trophic level, all right, we got these primary consumers, which are herbivores, all right? These guys feed on these guys, okay? When they do, heat is lost. Only 10% of the available energy from one step to the next gets transferred. The other 90% of what was there gets lost as heat, okay? So moving on, okay, a secondary consumer. This guy eats this guy, okay? So again, only 10% of what was left in this step transfers here, okay? The rest is lost as heat, all right? These guys die, okay? Detritus feeders and decomposers wind up eating on them. But again, the energy transfer is only 10%. Everything else gets lost as heat. Same deal here, these top carnivores, okay? Eat these guys, but only 10% of the energy that's available at this level transfers to this organism. The rest is lost as heat, okay? So in terms of a food chain and energy transferring through a food chain, it's not necessarily efficient to be at the top of the food chain getting the energy you get from that secondary consumer. Here is a food web, okay? This food chain right here is very simplistic. You're able to go from one step to the next to the next. A food web is at this interconnectedness of different food chains. So you've got phytoplankton here, okay? So basically phytoplankton, the zooplankton here eats the phytoplankton or krill, okay? These fish right here, okay, eat this, all right? The emperor penguin eats these fish. The leopard seal eats this. The killer whale eats the leopard seal, all right? And then humans at the top of the food chain can kill killer whales. So you've got a food chain that's right here, all right? But notice this guy is actually part of other food chains. So that's what creates a food web, okay? It's the interconnectedness of a bunch of different food chains, of which one individual member of the ecosystem can be a part of a number of different food chains in that web. So again, like I said before, usable energy decreases with each link in a food chain or a food web, okay? So biomass winds up decreasing at each higher trophic level because of all that heat loss. So like I said before, 90% of energy is lost with every single transfer, okay? 90%. So going back to that question I asked at the beginning, is it more efficient for humans to eat lower on the food chain? Is a vegetarian diet better in terms of energy that you're getting than a diet where you're eating organisms that are higher up on the food chain? An interesting thing to think about. So here's that pyramid of energy flow, okay? So we have an example. Let's say these producers have 10,000 kilocalories of energy available. So the zooplankton, these primary consumers, wind up feeding on those phytoplankton, okay? Of those 10,000 kilocalories, only 1,000 of them transfers into the zooplankton. Now you've got the secondary consumers, the perch, eating the zooplankton, all right? Well, they only have 1,000 kilocalories available. So the perch eats, and only 100 kilocalories of that was transferred to the perch. The rest was lost as heat. Then you have a human feeding on a perch. Only 10 kilocalories came from this 100. The rest is lost as heat, okay? So a human is not getting the same type of usable energy from this level, okay? Obviously, we're not going to be going and eating phytoplankton, but if we're eating down here at the producer level, we have much more energy available to us. Now, one of the things we're going to be talking about in here is the production of plant matter, okay? And there's two metrics at which we talk about the production of plant matter. There's gross primary productivity, and then there's net primary productivity, okay? Gross primary productivity, gross means just everything, okay? The rate at which an ecosystem's producers convert solar energy to chemical energy and biomass, okay? So it's just how much is being produced, how much energy is being produced by the ecosystem's producers. Net primary productivity is gross primary productivity, except you're taking away the rate at which producers use that energy for aerobic respiration, okay? So these two things are, gross primary productivity is a component of net, but net actually subtracts the rate at which producers use energy for aerobic respiration. Okay, so this is where you get those ecosystems and life zones being very different, okay? Simply because of what is the rate that these producers use energy for aerobic respiration. Here's a diagram from your book, and it talks about the net primary productivity in major life zones and ecosystems on the planet. And you'll see that swamps and marshes, tropical rainforest, and temperate forest are the top 3 terrestrial ecosystems with regard to net primary productivity. And estuaries is number 1 in terms of average net primary productivity, okay, per year. So some of the things that we talk about in the disappearance of ecosystems and the disappearance of habitats, okay, swamps and marshes, all right, are an area that is very, very important for water filtration, but also you've got diversity of organisms there. Those are kind of going away, all right. Swamps and marshes usually form at the emptying of a river into a larger body of water, okay. Tropical rainforests, off the charts along with swamps and marshes in terms of net primary productivity, okay. Temperate forests like the Pacific Northwest, all right. These areas are the ones that have a lot of issues going on. These are endangered ecosystems. These are the ones that tend to be eradicated for economic growth. So, 3 big ideas from this chapter, okay, because I skipped over the biogeochemical cycles because we've already done those. Number 1, flow of energy from the sun through the biosphere, cycling of nutrients, and gravity is basically what sustains life on the planet. Number 2, you've got producers, consumers, and decomposers and detritivores in an ecosystem to be able to either produce or consume other organisms to be able to get the nutrients they need. All right, and then number 3, human activities are altering the flow of energy through food chains and webs, okay, and the cycling of nutrients within ecosystems in the biosphere. All right, those human activities are taking away from the productivity, the net primary productivity of each one of those ecosystems. Those are the 3 big main ideas of this chapter. We're going to be doing some stuff in class dealing with some ecosystem logistics and the kind of corridoring and isolation of different types of ecosystems and what that would do for biodiversity within them. We're also going to be doing a lab on biodiversity. So I will see you soon.